The theme that's been running through today really is a concurrent that we grew up with when we were little. It's called emotion. And this fear aspect that was touched on earlier is driven by emotion. But one of the things that we've never really grown up to learn how to do anything with is how to understand that fear and how to control it. So if you think back to early years, are we ever introduced to the emotional labels of fear, sadness, anger? Do we even have a label for how we're feeling in a moment so that we can rationalize it? And so I found out quite late in life that I'd been having a battle with emotion all of my life. Emotion that made me think differently in certain circumstances, made me challenge myself, made me behave in ways with people that either built certain relationships in a certain way or killed relationships. So I've made it my mission to get to the bottom of what drives people to do what they do, but particularly young people, because we've got a focus at the moment which talks about trauma, mental health, self-harm, substance abuse, violence. And when you go deep into what this is, it's happening all over the world. So the question is, where do we start the learning curve about us, which we call self-awareness? And yes, mindfulness comes into that. That's an awareness of an emotion in the moment and being able to calm the mind enough to go from the emotional part of the brain to the front part of the brain, to think logically. But we have to ask ourselves the question, where does this learning start? When does it start? And what difference would it make to our lives? What difference would it have made to my life up till I was 41, when I happened to go into the deep dive process of behavioural science and realised I'd actually been suffering for most of my years with anxiety, driven out of emotion that I couldn't control. So when I got to my teenage years, I think back now at what I was like. What were some of the challenges that I was feeling? How was I dealing with those challenges with my emotions? Because my emotions are in my presence all the time. We heard earlier about the fact the brain processes information. Our senses are alive 24/7. Even when we're asleep, we're hearing, we're smelling, we're touching. So for young people, if you're never given the insight into yourself, how can we make you resilient? So in the face of adversity, distress, or trauma, how do young people cope? Because we fail to cope as adults. You see so many people struggling to cope with emotion. So you have to ask yourself another question. Is resilience about being able to return back to the shape you were at the moment of distress? Or is it a learning and development process that starts when we're young? And who does that learning and development process with us? Who are the key people in our lives that shape our ability to cope with those emotions, channel those emotions, and push them in directions that allow us to get to where we need to go? So in the case of firewalking, absolutely correct. How do you overcome that immediate response to say, I'm never going to go back into the water again? I'm never going to be friends with that person again because I fell out with them when I was 14. They did a horrible thing to me, so I hate them. How do we educate young people to build a skill inside themselves, which we know as emotional intelligence, which gives them the empowerment to drill down deep in times of need, to be able to reach out to people in ways that will meaningfully help them reach a decision or reach a goal? These are skills that even as adults, many of us have never managed to perfect. What we've learned is by default, by trial and error. How many people in the room have suffered with relationship problems because buttons get pressed that you're not aware of, because subconsciously your guard is down? How we think, how we deal with emotion is a process that we need to learn, develop, and perfect. As I travel the world, I've been in different villages, I've been in different communities, and what I'm finding now is young people, in the main, have no idea what these emotions are. And to a lot of people, particularly in the prison system, they think they're bad people because they can't express how they feel, and it's masking through different emotional responses that they give. So, is it any wonder why we suffer with self-harm, substance abuse, violence, detachment, social exclusion? Because we are not necessarily equipping ourselves through the generations to be able to cope with our natural bodily emotions. And as the world changes around us, we have an obligation to try and steer ourselves through it in the best way that we can, because it can't be done for us. Our logic won't allow it. So we have to have the skills. So the question that we have now is, who is working with our young people? Who are the professionals that we think are responsible for developing this skill set, this ability to be resilient through times of adversity, to deal with the emotions in the moment? Youth workers, educators, youth interventionists, community club coaches are all people that, in the main, are using three mediums that allow young people to connect through and into their emotions. But where it stops is the ability to use what science has taught us and the skill sets of emotional intelligence to help that young person understand, develop, and hone those skills so they own them. How many people are in caring environments where they have a support worker, and as soon as that support worker is removed from their lives, the support worker then feels the young person hasn't got the coping skills because we're not embedding anything into the young person. So my mission is to find out, where is the benchmark? Where are we starting to look in terms of being able to help those professionals and volunteer groups really make a difference in building those skills in young people from a very early age? Because we have a duty to try and right the wrongs of our own past, which is where we've learnt by trial and error. So this year we've launched what I'm classing as a litmus test to be able to say, if we were to be able to break down, which we can, the building blocks of resilience, measure them, and look at them, that gives us the building framework to be able to work with young people. It's something that I was never given when I was young. It's something I never really understood until I stepped into the arena that I'm in now. But our measurement stretches from Europe into Africa, the Middle East. And the spread of that information already is telling us, when we start talking about what is self-confidence, psychology's already told us that psychology's perception of self-confidence are three building blocks: self-liking, self-competence, and self-assurance. So if you were to say to a sports coach, an educator, or even a parent, how are you building self-confidence in that young person? Break it down. We can do it. We do it in other areas of the world in terms of business and other processes, but it's not necessarily reaching the front line. So this will start now to raise the questions, particularly in the UK, particularly in areas of the UK where I've managed to get buy-in to at least allow us in through the door to measure this, to say, now what are you doing with it? There's another element on the journey of my being here today with you, is many of the funding organisations that seek to see results believe they can't measure the soft skills, resilience, social emotional skills as they're required. These building blocks, there's 10 building blocks that we already are aware of in emotional intelligence. We can define them, we can break them down. You can use them in terms of coaching strategies. You can teach young people how to label how they feel. Self-reliance. What is a self-reliant young person? Independent? Yes. Responsible? Yes. So even with just 2 building blocks, they've got the language to understand how they're supposed to process through life. So the question now is, what are we trying to do with these social emotional skills in education? And when you look across the world, it's not necessarily about complex educational systems. It's about embedding. It's about having a process that stretches from the home, through the school, and into the community, deep enough that it's actually an embedded process. It's a way of life. It's a culture. And that is the culture of emotion. From that, we're able to regulate. So if you said to somebody, how do I build optimism in a young person? You've got to come back down through these building blocks. We have to build them systematically so that they can draw down on that information that's inside them. Optimism requires a level of adaptability. And as I call it, the mojo, the passion, the fire in the belly. How do you light that? How do you keep it going yourself rather than somebody give you that opportunity? So my survey allows us to say, so what are the tools that we're going to give to these young people, but equally, what are we measuring progress on? So they can see it, they can sense it, they can know what's happening, and they can develop this skill and awareness in themselves. This toolbox allows us to focus on 3 to 4 areas: self, us, and the outside world. Before you can even look to the outside world, you've got to ask yourself the question, what am I? Who am I? What am I trying to achieve? How do I dig down when times are hard, rather than just throw in and listen to the negative self-talk? It's not positive psychology anymore, it's a process. Learning and development creates the ability to be able to be resilient and bounce back. So the question again to our society is, how do we do this? Why would we do this? And how do we measure it? Once we've got these mechanisms in place, we're able to work on a level playing field. We're able to then set the standards. We're able to start to drill down. And it starts in early years. The measurement that's going on at the moment starts at 13 years. It's a psychological, emotional psychometric process that allows us to give the litmus test that then says, what are the levels of competencies? How do they cluster together? How do you assess a person's ability to be self-aware and to be able to self-manage before they even get near to having social skills, which every single employer at the moment is focused upon? Apprenticeship levy is focused on employability. So we have to match the building of these skills with this ability to be resilient at whatever level that resilience needs to be. So the government did a survey in 2015, released this survey, where they did a deep dive into youth work and education across the whole of the UK. Where are the frameworks for consistent and sustained self-development? Not from the teacher to the young person or the youth worker to the young person, but within the young person. And what's the standard of this? What are we actually making sure we're making happen within the dynamic? And why would we stop from the classroom? Why wouldn't we cascade this into community? Where would be the benefit to mental health from reducing anxiety and the impact of depression? More so, what would be the social economic benefit of being able to get close enough to the core of a young person to turn that core on, give them the confidence to be able to strive forward and have an optimistic outlook on life because they're self-aware? The government has recognised this. Education has recognised this. There's a requirement on mental health, support and provision from these same environments. So it tells us that there's an importance. The Middle East is now waking up to the fact that it has a youth development requirement for different reasons. Africa has the same requirement for youth social emotional development, in particular around the social emotional skills that sit within resilience, because they need the young people to be able to move forwards. So I'm looking now very much at challenging the norm. I'm challenging foundations that work in communities. I'm challenging education, and I'm challenging charities and saying, before you go for funding, before you try and reach into a project or a design process, what are you defining? What are you measuring? And then how are you building? Tell us how you're building so that we can assess it. And what do the young people believe you're giving to them? So before we reach into society, before we try and say that resilience is a great word, it's a sticking plaster, the challenge has to be back. Yes, we're focused on intellectual development, and yes, we're focused on cohesion. But where does all that come from in terms of the person, the young person, the person of tomorrow, the parent of tomorrow? All comes down to the ability to go inside, deal with life, deal with complexity, distress, overcome trauma, and look forwards. And these are skills. They're not skills that you pick up from a box. You develop them over time. And that requires consistent approach. Thank you.